presentation organizer, Hazen Stern. We're all very grateful to have you doing this.
Thanks for presence, Dave. Won't be able to stay that much longer. He's been around a long time. He's done a great job. I remember I was off St. Phillips and I leaned over in a kayak. I said, Dave, would you join the board? Sure. I almost fell out of my boat. I asked him that night.
11 years ago.
Yeah. In about, I think it was 2011, one of the kayaks I got to know through paddling, I just paddled the kayak for a year or two, and he asked me, would you like to go kayak camping to Long Island? I said, sure. I said, one question, where's Long Island? I didn't know. I heard Maraschine, and of course by the end of the night, we certainly know what Long Island is and a lot more information. And absolutely delighted he'll ask me, would you like me to do a prison on on Harbour Buffett? And of course, he didn't have to ask twice. Okay? So absolutely delighted. Thank you very much for doing this, Neil. Now, Neil actually grew up in Markham, Ontario. Did an undergraduate degree at Yale, biology, and a master's at UT. And en route to Newfoundland, spent good time, as we call it, in New Brunswick. Worked with the Canadian Wildlife Service on a whole bunch of different files, from loons to mercury. But I think with particular focus on archaeology. That was his career. And I guess living in Newfoundland for so long, he got interested in a lot of things, and it's amazing. He retired saying, I don't know how he could have done his job. But he was interested in archaeology, so about 8 years ago, he started working on an archeological degree. And just last year, he was particularly pleased, and now he's a graduate of mine. And he's currently, I said mentioned a lot of interest, but he's currently president of the shipwreck. I always get this wrong. Of the Shipwreck Preservation Society. And he's also a very accomplished scuba diver. So he's go, of course, around the world on many shipwrecks. And not only shipwrecks, but plane wrecks in Ireland. And I'm thinking this, I don't know if anyone's ever said to him, I thought, well, gee, maybe start calling him the master of disasters. And not only that, he's found time to involve, I'm not sure in what capacity, to trail the caribou and is going to Europe with his partner, who's not only his paddling partner, his life partner, Isabelle Hubert, who I think I saw there, who came from Yale to Madeline and works just up the road, I think. Yeah. So great advice to make tonight. And just before I turn it over, a good friend of mine, is here tonight. Not only is he a good friend, but he's also was a resident, spent his early years at Harbour Buffett. And when we did up for a private overview, we're looking at it. Came in here yesterday and we're looking at images of plane crash. I remember going back to 2011. We landed Harbour Buffett, walked from Kingwell, actually was across through this tunnel of spruce trees. I don't know if anyone's in there. It's just grown up like so. And I had cell phones, so I called Max. Well, Max gave me a tour of Harbour Buffett. And he said, you gotta go look for that plane crash. So all of a sudden, we started coming together. Anyway, so absolutely delighted that you can be here, Max, tonight. And I'd like to introduce Max Follett. Oh, and his wife Brenda's here tonight as well. She's not from Harbour Buffett. I think, again, talking to Neil, there's key questions and answers throughout. And I think it's obviously going to be very interesting. It's that plane crash. Max was a kid at the time, and he's going to fill in some blanks for us tonight and add to the whole conversation. So this is paddling, this is archaeology, and just because the last couple of people arriving, I'll shut up and turn it over to Neil Burgess. Thank you.
Hope everybody can hear me okay. Yeah, I kind of recognize Isabel, my partner in crime. She puts up with all my foolish ideas on where to go paddling. We haven't lost anybody yet, so she's lucky that way. But I wouldn't be able to do all these adventures without her. So she's the co-star tonight. There she is, right on the title slide. So I fell in love with the islands in Placentia Bay back in '95. I did 2 summers of work there, helping a Lund grad student study eagles and pollution in the chicks as they were growing up. And we were climbing in eagle nests all over these islands, Mirasheen, Long Island, over in the Raggeds. It's just such a magical place, especially when it's as calm as that, which it isn't always. So, well, I guess this thing ain't working. How the mystery began. I am gonna talk about the kayaking, but also about an archaeological mystery. And I hope I don't bore the pants off you. So what happened was I was contacted by somebody who came to the Shipwreck Preservation Society Facebook page and told me that there's a plane wreck behind Harbour Buffet in a pond. And that got me interested because I'd been to Harbour Buffet several times and I knew it was a beautiful spot to go visit. And he told me that the plane had crashed during World War II. And it was a big event for the community. And when he was a teenager, later on, he used to stand on the wing of the plane to fish in his waders in the pond. So all the kids, I guess, in town and all the adults probably knew about this plane wreck. But nobody in the archaeology office knew the location of it. They'd heard about a plane crashing on Long Island, but they didn't know the exact spot. So this kind person sent me a Google Earth map showing the pond with a little circle on it, and that was enough to get me interested. So everybody knows where Placentia Bay is there in the middle of the slide. So I'm going to focus in. We're talking about the islands there. Mirasheen is the big one on the left, and Long Island is the long skinny one on the right. And we'll look a little closer. And there's the islands. For kayaking here, you've got to obviously be very careful of southerly winds because they channel up between those islands and it gets quite rough quite quickly. I don't know if you can see the numbers there, but that eastern channel is deep. Over 100 meters deep. And we're going to focus there. So Harbour Buffet is near the bottom of Long Island. And we started directly east of there and we paddled straight west. So that's the detailed area. On the right, we started in a little village called Fairhaven. And there's a lovely slipway for putting in. And you can see there's a little island just at the exit of the harbor. Oh, hang on. Let's turn it on. That'll help. So there's a little island here when you exit out of the harbor, and then it's a long run across here to another little island, and then you're into Harbour Buffet. So, in case anybody wants to know, that's where Harbour Buffet is, and it is 12.5 kilometers. So, as I was telling Max, you want to pick your day. So you look at windy, look at the forecast, and get a nice calm day with flat seas to go across. Because you don't want to be fighting a real strong southerly blow, or it's going to be miserable paddling across a beam sea. Right? Yes, it works. So here's the put-in. Lovely slipway, protected harbor, easy going. We started out from there, loaded up all the camping gear and the kayaks, and took off. And as you go out of the harbor past that island, there's a nice buoy there, you can find your way. And then it's the crossing. And we were really lucky, as you can see, and it was absolutely flat calm. And we saw lots of seabirds on the way, some dolphins. And it took us about 2.5 hours to get across, because it was like perfect conditions. And that's the big smile when we got to the other side, because there's a beach just off the right there, and we could have a pee break, which was what we were both interested in at that point. But it was, I mean, paddling 12.5 kilometers is not a big deal for anybody. Mentally, doing it across an open crossing is more of a mental challenge than it is a physical challenge. Because we all paddle for 2.5 hours without taking a break, it's not a big deal, right? But mentally,
Was it a little foggy too?
it was a little foggy,
Yeah.
yeah. But, I mean, to be honest, if you got a GPS and it tells you where to go, you can't get lost. I was doing it old school just with a compass. I knew the bearing to get across, so. And actually the fog lifted as we were going across. So that's Harbour Buffett. And you can see it's an amazing closed harbor here. Some really cool little islands with cabins on them at the entrance. And there's a few cabins up here in what used to be northeast Harbour Buffett. And then most of the buildings are down in this area in Harbour Buffett proper. And the next thing we had to figure out is where are we going to camp? So this is Harbour Buffett, and you can see there's open grassy areas, but a lot of it slopes up from the water fairly steeply. So it's not ideal for camping. Like here and here, and all along here, it's fairly steep going up from shore, so it's not good camping spots. So to give you a little overview, that is where the wharf, the major wharf for the fish plant used to be, and there's remains of that now. But there's not really any good camping places right close by. There are not really attractive ones. So we looked elsewhere, and we found down in that grassy area at the bottom a really perfect spot. Perfect. And Max, you probably got names for all
That's
those.
exactly where we live, where our house is right in the middle of that circle.
Okay.
So
So that's so you can see what a view, eh? There's a little tiny island in the middle of the harbor. We had a creek here with fresh water right beside our campsite. There was a wharf there if you wanted to use a wharf, but we didn't. We just used the beach. And lovely grassy flat spot that was dry.
I was born exactly where that grass is.
No kidding.
Where
Wow.
that lady is sitting.
Well, you can see on that grassy spot too.
And you can see there's a house cabin here, really deluxe. And there's foundations and remains of houses everywhere. Because there's, the number of existing buildings now is just a fraction of what it used to be. And I'll show you some pictures coming up. But, I mean, talk about an ideal spot. And sheltered, there's hills all around here that shelter you from the wind. So it's great. And, I don't have a great picture of it, but in the morning, when we woke up in the tent, we had a pastoral alarm clock. So right outside the tent, there was there was like 3 curious sheep were just like 10 feet away from the tent, wondering what the hell this big blue thing was. So they're everywhere. So it's basically free-range sheep all around Harbour Buffett. So you run into them as you walk around the village everywhere. So we woke up the next morning. It's about what? I don't know, a little less than a 2-hour drive from here to Fairhaven. An hour to pack up your boat, 2.5 hours to get across. So we just kind of lazed around that supper, set up camp, and went to bed. And the next morning we woke up and we decided to explore. And I knew a little bit about the place. That's a picture of Harbour Buffett. And our campsite would be right over here. That's Harbour Buffett in 1907. And notice this church, great big church. And I got another slide from a little later. That's Harbour Buffett looking the other way. This is looking towards where that first picture was taken. So our campsite is down here. And there's the church. Great big church. And then check this out. 2-story high fishing premises for W.W. Wareham. Okay, the big fishing company that worked in Placentia Bay. And they had a huge fish plant here, and it's actually, this part coming down this way is just as big as this part is. So great big fishing premises. And this was actually a fish drying plant for salt cod. And they built that in the late 50s. So it was very much a going concern right up until they were resettled in 1967. And as I said, there's only a fraction of these buildings left now. The church is completely gone, except for the concrete front steps that led up to the front door. Everything else is gone at the church. There's the graveyard, which is in these trees here and curves around the back, is still there, but it's completely growing up with trees. The fish plant, I'll show you a few pictures of it, but it is largely gone. So all of these things in this big building there is completely gone. So it's amazing how quickly things disappear. And as I said, this was resettled in 1967. So you can figure out how many years that is. This is home for the flock of sheep in the winter. So that's the sheep barn. Sorry, Max, you said his name was?
Hollett, H-O-L-L-E-T-T,
Stan Hall. And he's in poor health now, he's not getting out there much, I suppose. Right over by his house, there's these fishing rooms. There's also a lovely war memorial for the First World War that's got names of the men from Harbour Buffett that died in the war. And like many World War I memorials that you see around Newfoundland, there's a trophy from the German army. So that's a German trench mortar. And the Canadian government brought thousands of these German cannons and trench mortars and all kinds of stuff over to use as trophies with war memorials around the country. Now I mentioned the fishing premises of W.W. Wareham. That is the fish drying plant there. That's what's left. So you remember in that first picture, it was 2 stories high. And what I found really interesting, it's no secret I'm a shipwreck geek. That wharf is actually built on a wooden ship. That's the bow, and that's the deck that's twisted over at 45 degrees. So they built that wharf on a ship. And you can see, this is a side view of the same thing. There's Isabel. Concrete basement wall left of that building that used to be 2 stories high. There's the bow of the ship. The ship goes under the wharf and sticks out the other side. And I promised you 2 shipwrecks in this one. There's the other shipwreck on the far side of the harbor. Great big ship, and I'll get to that later. I'll keep you hanging on that. So that's the bow of the ship underwater on the wharf. And that's the midsection and the stern that's canted over it at 45 degrees. So I don't think it's long for this world. But it's amazing how much history there is in these places, right? So that's what's left of the fish plant. Now, here is a picture from '58 of them building that 2-story fish drying plant. Right? So that's the floor of the 2nd story right there. And take a look at this. because we're gonna come back to this in a minute. This is the other part of the fishing premises. Again, it was 2 stories. It was a big operation. That's a picture of some schooners tied up to the fish drying plant there. And notice they had these big storage tanks in the back. I'm not sure what they would have been for, Max, any idea?
Probably supply fuel oil to the dryer, I would say.
Yep, that would make sense. Now, let me come back to this picture and I'll draw your attention to this building, because that is what's left of it. Okay, that whole building was built on pilings driven into the ground, and is basically sitting on a wharf above the water. And that's all that's left, is the concrete wall behind it and the pilings. Now, I'll get to the search for the mystery airplane, okay? We had the Google Earth photo that I received from the person who contacted me. And looking at that, we figured out how to get to this pond, which doesn't have a direct access, and get to where the plane was. So I figured out we need to go up this hill, which we did, through the woods, down the other side of the ridge. We got to the pond, and lo and behold, there was the wing of the plane. And it was like 10 feet out from shore. Couldn't be easier to find, right? And it was in probably a meter of water, really shallow. So I wouldn't say we solved our mystery, but we found the plane wreck that we were looking for, and that was all we were going to do on this trip. And then we kept poking around. And as we were there, these 2 guys rowed over from the other end of the pond, and one of them was a son of a couple that used to live over on this side, Job's Cove. And this was, they spent time out here as teenagers. They'd never even heard of the plane wreck. So they saw us on shore and rowed over to us and said, "What are you guys doing?" They said, "We're looking at the plane wreck." And they went, "What?" So they grew up coming out here in the summers and never even heard of the plane wreck. So that's the plane. The U.S. Navy had a squadron of these Hudson bombers stationed at Argentia all through 1942, and they would fly out looking for German U-boats, and they carried depth charges and they bombed them. So, and I'll have a connection for you in a minute. This is a story that goes off in many different directions, right? But you can see these are pretty substantial planes, big 2-engine planes, long range. They carried usually 4 guys in them because they had to have a bombardier for dropping the depth charges on the submarine. They had a gunner who was also a radio operator, and a pilot co-pilot. So this particular one that we found in the pond, I did some research, and we found out that it crashed on the frozen pond on July 29th, 1942. And I want to tell you a sobering story, because most people don't know much about the Canadian Air Force and US Navy Air Force flyers that were doing anti-submarine patrols and how dangerous that job was. These guys flew out and they'd done a 6-hour patrol over the North Atlantic, and they flew back, and as they were flying back to Argentia to land, a winter storm closed every airport in Newfoundland. How would you feel in a plane flying around knowing that all the airports you can reach with the fuel in your plane are closed and you can't land it? So what the pilot did is he flew around for 3 hours circling Argentia, hoping for a hole in the clouds. When his fuel got low, he had to give up on Argentia. He dropped his depth charges in the ocean, and he homed in on a hill right by Harbour Breton, there was a radio homing beacon for landing at Argentia. And he flew to that beacon, and at the last minute, he could see the frozen pond in front of him. And he must have just cut the power completely to the engines to be able to come over the hill and hit the pond and not hit the woods on the other side. That pond's less than 1 kilometer long. And it has high hills on 2 sides of it. He crashed the plane onto the ice in the pond. It skidded across the ice and hit the bank on the shoreline hard and caught fire. None of the 4 guys in the plane were injured. One of them was knocked out temporarily, but the 4 guys got out. It was only 100 meters from Harbour Buffett over that ridge. People from Harbour Buffett poured out to the plane, pulled the guys out of the burning plane, took them in their houses, fed them, you know, took care of them for a couple of days, and eventually a fisherman took them back in his boat to Argentia. So, quite the story. And if we have time at the end, if somebody's interested, I've got a really great add-on about the pilot. So if you're interested in that, you ask me when we're done. No, there's too many tangents in this, that's the problem. So if somebody's interested in that, I'll tell you later. Okay, so I think from reading between the lines of the accounts that I've seen, I think the wind was up, that storm lasted for more than a day, and they had to stay in Harbour Buffett for maybe a day or two, waiting for the seas to calm out so that they could get in a fishing boat and go across to Argentia. Now, I'm gonna leave this up. I promised you that there was a story attached to this where this crash brought happiness to Harbour Buffett. So here's the story for that. The U.S. Navy brings Christmas happiness to Harbour Buffett. So during all the war years, and I spent maybe a few years after, the U.S. Navy came in their crash boat from Argentia with one of their sailors dressed up as Santa Claus with a huge bag of presents for all the kids in the communities around Harbour Buffett. Right? So there you can see Santa with all the kids mopping him. And there's another picture, more kids mobbing Santa. And I got a message from somebody on Facebook when I posted our original pictures. He said, I was 6 years old when that plane crashed, and these gifts that we got from the American Navy were the best Christmas presents I ever had as a kid. They beat what my parents could afford by a long shot, right? So that's the happy story. And Max, how long did that continue? Do you remember?
There's a little change that I got to interrupt you there.
Oh, yes, please.
Sorry to do this, but in reality, the American government didn't supply the whole thing.
Okay.
A lot of the people from Placentia Bay worked on the base in Argentia, and somebody took up a collection there. And these people, they needed every cent, but they still gave money, so it wasn't all from the American government. A lot of it was from the workers around the bay who worked on the base. And as a result, when the base closed down, the money dried up, and no longer did the American Santa visit our home.
But how long was that? Because the base kept going for a long time.
Yes, it kept going for a while, that's true. But the American government didn't supply the whole shop.
Right on.
That was one interesting thing, that people thought that the American government, when people came home from the base and said, look, we contributed to the kids' gifts. The American service fellows did come. They were Santa Claus. They brought a band and played carols there in Harbour Buffett. The first time a band had ever been in the school there. But anyway, the gifts really came from the workers on the base.
Right on.
But, yes, kids were very appreciative.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the base must have been a big employer back in the war, especially, I think.
Yeah, the base was a big employer, exactly, yeah.
And good wages, I imagine.
And good wages and cash wages.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I do a lot of work in St. Lawrence and Lawn in connection with the Pollux and Truxton shipwrecks, the American Navy warships that crashed into the coast there. And they have exactly the same story. The American crash boat brought over Santa every Christmas to St. Lawrence and Lawn, the same thing. So, stopping with history and getting back to kayaking. Harbour Buffett. If I need to say anything more to entice you to consider Long Island as a kayaking trip, look at all these dotted lines going out from Harbour Buffett. They're all hiking trails or quad trails, so you can get around to half a dozen different resettled settlements, communities. You can go up to Kingwell, you can go over here to Port Royal, you can go up to northeast Harbour Buffett, go down to Coffin's Cove. I mean, there's trails going all over Long Island. So it's great walking. If you did like what we did, paddle your guts out for a day, take a day off to hike around and explore, and then paddle your way back. Lots to do. So, for example, let me point out, that's Port Royal there, and you can see the trail going across to Port Royal Cove. That's it. That's the community. So, really nice spot, right? And all these places would have had a church, and a graveyard, and probably a school in the day, I suppose. So, going concerns lots of fishermen and their families in these communities before resettling. So, us, me and Isabel, we started this trip with a really nice forecast for coming back. And then the forecast got progressively worse and worse as the days went by. And of course, we were listening on our VHF radio to the weather report that the Coast Guard puts out. And we decided we better wake up bright and early and get a good early start, because the wind was definitely coming up on the last day for going home. So we packed up early and got going. And of course, the back band on my kayak seat decided to let go that day. So I had to jury rig a partial solution, but it was partial at best. So on the way out, we visited our second shipwreck. This is a huge whaling vessel. It actually was from Japan, and in the late 60s, it worked out of Williamsport. There was a whaling station on the east side of the northern peninsula, south of Great Harbor Deep, called Williamsport, and the ruins of it are still there today. Huge tanks and all kinds of stuff there. But the whaling company that owned that whaling shore station hired this Japanese boat to come over, and it fished for several years. I think they killed 2,100 fin whales with this ship. And they rendered down the oil and the bone meal and all that in Williamsport. And in 1972, there was an international moratorium on whaling, and all of these whaling companies were put out of business. And to be honest, whaling in Newfoundland was always boom and bust. The companies would go crazy for about 10 years and they'd wipe most of the whales out, and then they shut down for 20 years and then they'd come back again. So this ship ended up in Placentia, or Argentia, I think, at the wharf, for several years, rusting away. And eventually the folks running the harbor said, get rid of it. So it ended up in Harbour Buffett, up on the rocks. But it's interesting to visit. That's the name of the ship there on the back, Fumi Maru number 15. And on our crossing on the way back, I won't exaggerate. I think we had 2-foot waves and about 15 knots of wind. It was interesting on the way back. And what had been 2.5 hours coming across was, I think, 3.5 hours going back. And it was tiring, because it was a beam wind the whole way, beam wind, beam seas. So this is us on that little island just outside of Fairhaven. The first opportunity to get ashore and have a sandwich and have a pee and ease my sore muscles. I had to do a stomach crunch the whole way over because my back band was hurting. It was not as much fun as the trip 3 days before. And that's it. So I'll do one postscript, and that is, this was in July last year, and I went back with, I don't know if any of you know Lisa Daly. Her email address is Plane Crash Girl. She's an aviation archaeologist here in Newfoundland. I went back with her, and we did an archaeological survey on the plane wreck, and we found part of one engine, one of the radial engines from the plane, and some of the aluminum structure of the fuselage and that wing, and we documented all that. And I've actually just submitted an article to the Provincial Archaeology Review. So that'll get published, so if you're interested in that, you can just email me. Send you a PDF of that in a few weeks. And that's pretty much it for this.
Yeah, how long you been waiting actually to go back and move the weather?
I think we had to get back or something. You know how it is. Places to go, people to see. I can't remember what the reason was, but we didn't need to get back. And it wasn't that bad. I mean, 15 knots of wind, I wouldn't want to paddle in any more than that. No. I didn't take any pictures, that tells you something. There?
Yeah, were you in touch with our Argentina Coast Guard radio?
No, I didn't bother. We had really good visibility. So the one thing, and that's a good point to make, the tanker traffic going up to Whiffen Head, it's unbelievable when you're in a small boat how fast those tankers go. Like, what was a dot on the horizon 5 minutes later is huge and coming at you at a frightening speed. So if you were ever to make this crossing in the fog, there is Placentia traffic is run by Coast Guard, and they monitor all the ship traffic coming up and down. You can just go on channel 16, talk to Placentia traffic, and they will tell you if you're clear or if there's a big ship coming in the next hour or so. Because you would not want to be in the fog and see one of those loom up on you, because you would not get out of the way. They come fast. Thanks, Pierre. That's a real good point. Any other questions?
Just a comment.
Yep.
Off the west coast of Long Island, it's actually between Rosaru Island and Marisheen, there's an abandoned whaling station there. And there's also a shipwreck there.
Yes, there is.
Which nobody seems to know anything about.
Well, I dove on it.
Okay.
And I have been researching that and talking to, I'm trying to remember the name of the fellow, Dickinson and Sanger, published books on the whaling industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. None of us can figure out the name of that ship. There's no record of any ship having sunk there. So I don't know. It's about 120 feet long. It's much the same as the ships at Conception Harbor. Looks the same. But putting a name on it, I don't know. That's another great place to visit if you're kayaking out in Placentia Bay, is the Rosaru whaling station, because there's lots of stuff to see there. Anything else? Are you gonna ask me? Okay. Okay, so the pilot. The pilot was William Tapuni, and he actually got a commendation out of that crash. The rear admiral from the fleet air arm in the United States Navy commended him for his excellent judgment and his steely nerve in landing that plane and saving all of his crew, because that was a pretty extraordinary bit of flying, finding a hole and getting down and landing when it was a blizzard. Because the guys at Argentia had given up hope on those guys. But the story with him is a month after this crash, he was up flying an anti-submarine patrol in another Hudson down off Cape Race, and he was the first American serviceman to sink a German U-boat in the Second World War. And he got a Distinguished Flying Cross for that.
What location?
Off Cape Race. So it's U-656, and there's been a bunch of Americans up 10 years ago searching for it, trying to find it. So that's another one on my list. If we can nail that one down, that'd be nice. Anyway, so that was the first German U-boat sunk by American forces in the Second World War. And Mr. Taponi, Ensign Taponi, survived this crash and went on to greater glory. The bad part of the story is in '44, he was killed when his bomber was shot down out in the Pacific Islands fighting the Japanese. He was shot down in Cebu in Philippines.
Would that first sinking have been in 1942?
Yep. Yep, it was the 1st of March, '42. Yep. And the guys, his colleagues in the squadron, sank 2 more U-boats in the following months. They did really well in '42. The Germans sent a lot of U-boats to the Newfoundland coast in '42. And that was the other part of the equation. Okay.
There's another slant to that. Some people say, if you look at Reed's Pond closely, it's like a figure 8. There's a point which juts out, and some people say that he said that if he known the point, he thought the wings would break off going between the point of land and the other side. If he had taken the whole pond instead of half the pond, he thinks they would have survived, or they would have had an easier crash land.
Yeah.
But having to take half the 8 pond was shaped of 8, having to take that, they had a lot of momentum and went up the hill, broke off the wings and fell back, caught fire.
Yeah.
Had he known the pond was as long as it was, and
They would have had a hard time because the hill at the other end of the pond in Job's Cove is high. So they had to get over that and then get down to the pond immediately. I'm amazed they accomplished what they did.
yeah, they did well that they did.
And like having flown around for 3 hours, your nerves would be shot.
So they were very close to the tower of the church just before they crashed. He circled that tower until, I guess he was trying to use up his fuel, I would say. But there was heavy bitter that day and not very nice dog. Gale wind from the northeast. But he managed to put her into the northeast wind to come down, so he did pretty well.
Yeah. Good. Has anybody got any kayaking questions? We're going out there. It's a great spot.
Are you taking the next move out there again?
Oh, jeez. To be honest, I normally go from Arnold's Cove, and here, let me back this up, see if I can borrow.
Island's only 7 kilometers.
Back it up, 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 back up, back. There. So if you start from Arnold's Cove, which is just off the top here, you can hop from Little Island to Little Island down to the north end of Long Island, and none of those crossings are more than 5K. So it's mentally, it's a much easier crossing. The distance is still about 12K, but you're hopping from one island to the next.
Can you point out the pond there where the crash landed?
Oh, sure, let me go ahead a couple. Yeah, there, that's the pond. Now, you notice I'm being a little cagey and not telling you exactly where the plane wreck is. That's because I had a permit from the Provincial Archaeology Office to do this study on the plane, and they do that on the condition that I don't release the exact coordinates for the plane wreck to the public, because they're worried about people going in souvenir hunting there.
So is a full plane there?
No. So what happened was the Navy salvaged the one wing, parts of the engine, and the tail to use for repairs of other planes. And so I don't know how they got them out of there, but they got it out of there. They didn't have a helicopter back in those days. So they salvaged a bunch of it, but they left one wing and one engine and the other parts that we found there.
That World War I miners,
Maybe they did in winter, I don't know.
the World War I miners, you still read names on there?
Yep, yep, you can read the whole thing. There's a caribou hat badge for the Newfoundland Regiment up at the top of the monument. Yes, there's Latin inscriptions. I've got all the pictures, you know, so if you're interested in that one, yeah, I can tell you who's on it and everything. But it's amazing how much history there is from the fishery industry in Placentia Bay around here. On the other side, on the other side here, there's a schooner wreck that I dove on at about 60 feet. It was also owned by the Wareham. The schooner was called the Alberta Wareham. And it sunk out here loaded with bags of flour. And there was an older fellow up in Spencer's Cove that told me after that ship sunk, some of the bags of flour washed up. And if you ate smoky flavored tea buns, you know where the flour came from. Because the schooner burned and sank. But when we dove on it, the hold of the ship is still full of all these bags of flour stacked up one on the other. Yeah. I got pictures of that too. So you gotta follow me on Facebook.
It's interesting with the Wareham, because in Arnold's Cove, there's a fish plant, and Bruce Wareham was the manager for many years, passed away. His son, Alberto Wareham, is now the manager. And what did you say was the name of the boat?
Alberta Wareham.
Yeah.
So I think it was his grandfather, the boat was named.
Right, that would make sense.
So the Warehams were the big fish company that worked all these harbors. All these fishermen in the harbors sold their fish to the Warehams. And like you said, when they resettled in '67, the Warehams moved their operation.
So did they do, like, was that copper, was that whale as well?
No, this was all salt cod. Like that drying plant was for drying cod, because everybody knows what the weather's like in Placentia Bay. You don't have sunny days to dry cod. So they actually built the plant, I think, to help the process. I shouldn't say that, Pierre, it's not that bad, eh? No, there's lots of sunny days. But this was all salt cod.
We worked on the place there, and it's amazing how much fish is there, thousands and thousands of cans. Matter of fact, the Warehams collected the fish from Labrador right around. And there was so much employment that they had to build sleeping quarters for fellows to come in. But there weren't enough people in Harbour Buffet to supply it.
So they built bunk houses for workers.
They were building that fish plant in
58.
and then shut her down, 67, so it wasn't
Yeah.
running long.
But you gotta realize too, like, what was the arc of the salt fishery in Newfoundland? And because even in '58, frozen fish would have been increasing, and salt fish would have been on the decline. And in the '60s, that was certainly the case. People wanted frozen fish, not salt cod. here in North America. The Warehams were obviously selling to Europe or the Caribbean. With the
So I just
salt
was there,
fish.
I'm going to do my exam, Portuguese.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you comment a little bit more as to how you guys keep your finger on the pulse with respect to the weather? Because 15 knots isn't like a huge amount of wiggle room, especially
No, it
in
isn't.
Placentia
It
Bay.
isn't. So once you get out, if you got cell phone coverage, you can use Windy. It's good. I find it's good. I'll tell you, I used to work for Environment Canada, and I'll tell you a story about weather forecasting in Environment Canada. When I started there 30 years ago, weather forecasts were accurate. Nowadays, you'll notice this, weather forecasts are always pessimistic, right? They always say, what is the worst it could possibly be? And quite often it's nowhere near that bad. You'll see that with snowstorms often. Environment Canada will give you a range, right? And the snow will be much less than what they forecast. What they're doing is they've been told by the lawyers, they need to say, what's the reasonably worst case that it could be, and that's what they put in the forecast. So that nobody can come back and say, it was way worse than you forecast. So you have to keep that as a kayaker, you have to keep that in mind. Sometimes it won't be as bad as Environment Canada says it will be. Sometimes it will be worse, but usually it won't be so bad.
You guys
So-
spent 2 nights there?
We spent 2 nights, it was out of cell phone range, so we used the Weather Channel on the VHF radio. So there's a continuous broadcast of weather forecasts from Environment Canada that the Coast Guard puts on the VHF radio.
If it was, say 20 knots, would you stay, or would you consider?
I would definitely stay.
Would you go up Long Island though, would it be any better? With
Sorry?
the following sea going right up to the end of North Harbour and going to Armstrong?
Yeah, I would probably just wait it out. Quite often, if you wait till supper time, the wind will drop. Sometimes not, but sometimes it will drop. And if all you want, this is July, so we've got daylight until past 9 o'clock. So that's lots of time to get across if you want to wait till supper time to see if it's better. I wouldn't have gone if it got worse than 15, and if we got part way out and it was worse than 15, I would have come back. I mean, it's not worth it, right? You're only late for something, who cares?
Neil, another kayaking question. As a kayaker, what are your thoughts on the origin of that shipwreck on the southwest coast? Nothing to do with that.
The one at Cape Ray, you mean?
Yeah.
I was out and surveyed that with the Provincial Archaeology Office. I can tell you it's definitely not from here. There were, if you're familiar with ships, there are knees in the ship, so a kind of a 90-degree angle of wood that were 14 inches square and 9 feet high. And there was a whole bunch of them. So that was a huge ship. The hull fragment that was there was 111 feet long. And that was the keel minus the ends of the ship. So the ship was probably 150 feet or more long. It was a huge sailing ship. And my guess would be it's from Europe. And based on where most of the ships were coming from that were coming past Cape Ray, it's probably from England, but it could have been French, it could have been Spanish, it could have been Basque. But the probabilities are it was British or French. There's a slight possibility it might have come from down the Atlantic seaboard in the States, because in the 1800s, the Americans were coming up and sealing and whaling in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it's possible it might be an American ship, but I doubt it. So we took wood core samples for tree ring analysis, and that's now with a professor in the Department of Geography at MUN, and she's doing something called dendrochronology. And what you're doing is pattern matching the tree rings. Some are wide, some are narrow, and you're pattern matching that against reference collections from different countries for the specific tree species that you're looking at. And you can actually date when the tree was cut if you have the outside rings of the tree, which we do in this case. And so you can figure out when the tree was cut and then guess that probably within 5 years the ship was built using that wood. So we have a date approximately for when the ship was built. Then we can start narrowing down what ship that might be. My guess is Europe. And it could be a fishing vessel, it could be a trade vessel, it could have been an immigrant ship. In the mid-1800s, there were hundreds of immigrant ships coming from England and Ireland all through the 1800s. So, like, I looked at a 10-year period in the 1830s, there were 12 big ships that came to grief at Cape Ray, just in 10 years. So, over a century, there's a lot of ships it might be. So we've got to narrow it down as best we can. Based on that wood analysis, we've also got construction details of the ship that may help us too. It had a very strange metal sheathing. It wasn't copper. It was a kind of brass alloy. I think they call it Muntz metal. And that was only used for a fairly narrow period in the 1800s. So we can kind of narrow it down with that too. So, yeah.
How did the New York Times get hold of you? How did that happen?
Facebook's a wonderful thing. So I was on BBC Television, BBC Radio, BBC Online, Agence France Presse, New York Times. I was joking with the reporter. I had a Zoom call with her she was in Minnesota, I think. And I was saying, is this a slow week? Is Donald Trump not set in his Why are you worried about a Newfoundland shipwreck in the New York Times? She said, no, this is interesting stuff. And I said, you mean it's a pile of, and you know, like one media carries this thing, and then 10 media carry it, and then it goes bigger from there. But it was a slow news week. Like, I can't get anything else. There you go.
What was the population, the summertime population when you were out there? Like how many people were around you?
When we kayaked out, there was nobody. In early July, there was no one.
Okay.
It was a weird weekend. Like I was surprised when we got out there and nobody was there. But when we went back in October, there were 2 big powerboat cabin cruisers there, and there was a bunch of people there in the houses. No, I got a new powerboat, and we went over to the Rosaroo whaling station. If you got to do work, kayaking.
How many people were there at the height of the activity?
Max?
Roughly 350 probably.
350, but then over in Port Royal there'd be how many?
Probably 50 over there.
50 in Kingwell?
Kingwell probably 200.
200. So when you start adding up the different, and there were more communities further up Long Island, and there were many communities over in Mirasheen and Ragged as well. So there was a lot of people living on the islands in Placentia Bay.
There was tremendous employment there. No such thing as anybody unemployed. They had to go outside the island to get people to come and work there.
Good. Okay, do you want me to do the, okay. So, I've got an interesting, I'm gonna ask you a question. It's gonna be a little strange. I was way back 20 years ago, probably. I was the president of KNL. And then I was the editor for the Ebb and Flow for 5 or 6 years maybe. How many people in this room have been on the board of directors of Tumble Home or KNL or PNL? okay? So it's a minority, right? The club operates based on the volunteer efforts of those people that are willing to sit on the board of directors. If you're a kayaker or a canoeist here, enjoying the events of the club, I'd really encourage you in the future to think about joining the board next year or the year after or whatever. Talk to your board members now or people who've been on it before and ask them the rewards you get out of it. You know, you get to accomplish things. If you have a pet project, you can run with it. Don't be shy, and don't think you have to be an expert kayaker to make a worthwhile contribution to the board.
Or stand up paddleboard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You can tell I'm a dinosaur, right? I don't stand on paddleboard. Okay, so that was my plug for the club, because I know that sometimes it's hard to get good people to volunteer for the board, and people feel intimidated that they're like a beginner or they don't have enough experience, and why should I be on the board? Well, if you're energetic and you want to make a contribution and you have a positive attitude, you'd be great. So in that vein, I want to embarrass Dave Hickey a little bit. Dave has been president of PNL for 5 years, right? Well, part of 5 years, right? Yes. Made a great contribution, and Dave is going to step down at the end of August from being president, right? End of April. What am I saying, August? You don't want to hear that noise. End of April. What am I saying? And I just wanted to acknowledge on behalf of the club the huge contribution that he's made. And all the effort and thought that he's put into his time as president and before that on the board. And recognize his efforts, because it really is a big deal to be president. I know that. You're carrying the weight, and you're always thinking about it and organizing and worrying about the next event and all this kind of stuff. And it's really great that Dave has stepped up and done that for the last 5 years. So, thank Dave, being the humble guy that he is, he hates mess, but it's good to recognize his accomplishments. So, thanks for coming out, everybody. You guys got anything?